Good afternoon. Thank you to the MHS and MCA for organizing this meeting. I'm here to talk to you today about so-called dollars and a bunch more words, but basically I'm going to handle the themes of this presentation, talking about so-called dollars in memory and in art. The one on the title slide here, I wanted to get something up that actually is a so-called dollar from Boston, given our current location. Plus, I like the eagle, and I didn't have an excuse to put it in here otherwise. So what is a so-called dollar? Generally speaking, a so-called dollar is a commemorative metal, roughly dollar-sized. It's been used, the term has been used for a long time in my speaking, not so long in terms of numismatic history, around the turn of the 19th to 20th centuries. It was originally used more specifically to refer to Bryan dollars, Bryan money, which were literally so-called dollars. Grew from there to refer to some of the other silver dollar-sized metals, especially produced for the revolutionary Centennial in 1876. But there's a lot of wiggle room in the definition. What does commemorative mean? And what does roughly the size mean? And by the way, are we talking about a silver dollar or a gold dollar? And various other things. So there have been some catalogs published about so-called dollars, each of these with very creative titles. The middle one, produced by Harold Hibbler and Charles Capon in 1963, is the one that was most responsible for introducing folks alive and people of our era to so-called dollars. They produced a zillion of this book. It was coin dealers, I understand, hated it. They couldn't sell it for years and years and years and years and years. Stacks of them and stacks of them. And eventually, even huge publications do run out eventually. So by the end of the 1990s and early 2000s, the middle yellow book was out of print. I'm here talking today because I was involved, one of the editors, in getting the second edition of the Hibbler and Capon book republished about 10 years ago. Expanded somewhat, updated somewhat, but really keeping to the themes of what they published in 1963. So what did they say in 1963? They had some rules. It had to be United States only, certain size dimensions, not hold, not loop, not plastic, no presidential, a bunch of other things. All of which is very fine. A lot of it makes sense, and I think every single rule was violated in their book. So what does it actually mean for to be a so-called dollar? There's a few practical definitions. One practical definition is if it's in the book, and the book says so-called dollars, then it must be a so-called dollar. Another one is that, well, read what they said in words and apply that to other stuff, and if it matches the definition, then you must be pretty good. That was particularly useful because, of course, the 1963 book doesn't have any metal produced after 1963, of which there were many, especially for the Revolutionary Bicentennial, and many other examples since then. You could also say, yeah, read the rules and fudge them some more if you want, but that's the general spirit. To me, there's only one rule that really matters, and that's to just collect what you want and have some fun doing it. So I'm going to talk today about some of the fun that I've been having with so-called dollars and show you some examples of what so-called dollars are and tie them a little bit to the themes of this conference. So some common themes of so-called dollars. Fundamentally, so-called dollars are commemorative metals. So the themes of commemorative metals are things that get commemorated. A lot of dead men and women, buildings, seals, maps, stuff like that. I'd say the vast majority of so-called dollars have something along these lines, and I'm not going to go too much into these because variations on a theme aren't all that interesting, but I just wanted to put this up to give you some idea of what sorts of spectrum of metals we're talking about. Also, unlike the rest of the pictures in this presentation, the ones on this slide are to scale. You can see a little bit about the size. The copper one in the middle of the bottom row is among the larger. It's about 41 millimeters. The building to the right of it is about 35 millimeters. Several of these are 38 millimeters, including the one at the bottom right. 38 millimeters is the size of a US silver dollar. The little one on the bottom left it was produced by coin dealer Thomas Elder for the Hudson Fulton celebration. That's the size of a gold dollar. And as I said, there's exceptions to every rule, but this is basically what we're playing with. I do want to point out, as another local nod, the second from the left is a so-called dollar produced for the centennial of the Battle of Lexington in 1875. This is important to me because I grew up in Lexington. This was the sort of metal that introduced me to so-called dollars. That metal was struck in 4 different compositions: white metal, bronze, this is silver, and there were 4 struck in gold. So-called dollars have generally-ish smallish mintages. A few hundred is typical. 4 is low. We know this is struck by the U.S. Mint for the celebration, so we know from the U.S. Mint records that there were 4 struck in gold. I know where 3 of them are. Those 3 are all in Lexington at the moment. If anyone finds the 4th, I would love to hear from you. So moving on to some of the themes of this conference, I want to talk a little bit about memory. Commemoratives, by their definition, are commemorating something. They're commemorating a current event or a past event. And some of these memories are related to the founding and the growth of America as a country. During the period that we're talking about, so-called dollars roughly from the 1860s to certainly before the book was published in 1963, a period of looking back in many areas. This is one of several Western-themed medals. This was produced for the 1898 Trans-Mississippian International Exposition. The flip side, which I haven't shown here, is a generic woman with a current 1898 date. This is looking back to what was happening in the Omaha area 50 years earlier, which was very much Western from our perspective. The theme of a Native American rider on horseback going after the buffalo is common-ish. It's used in several forms. I happen to like this. It's a very stark design, very graphic. The art on the rider isn't all that great, but overall, I really like looking at this design. I have on the bottom left for all of these slides the HK numbers. These are from the 63 edition by Hibbler and Kaplan. That's where the numbers come from. Many of these were struck in multiple metals. This one is silver, but the design type was struck in silver, bronze, brass, and copper. These were struck by a number of entities. There's no production restrictions for so-called dollars. It matches the size and content criteria. That's good enough for me. This one, as many of the ones in this presentation, was struck at the U.S. Mint. I like U.S. Mint metals. I like the quality of their design and execution, so that's what I'm showing in many cases. This is a little less positive towards the Native Americans. One of many metals produced in the 1870s, 1880s, reflecting back on the events of 100 years earlier. The Battle of Wyoming actually did happen in Wyoming, but if you're wondering about the geography, this is Wyoming, Pennsylvania. It was not a high point for relations at the time, but it was remembered. There's a big centennial celebration in 1878. These medals were designed and engraved by George Morgan, who worked at the U.S. Mint, is known for the Morgan silver dollar. A lot of different metals, all this same general design. This one is much later. This is the 1932 250th anniversary of William Penn's arrival in America, designed by Julio Coligny, who was prolific in this time period. And this was struck by the Whitehead and Hogue Company. We saw many of the lower quality badges produced by Victor David Brenner. The Whitehead and Hogue Company overlapped with Brenner in terms of production, and it also made typically pretty low quality stuff. This is a great medal. I love this medal. It's high quality. This one was actually struck in 2 different sizes. There's a 3-inch size, much bigger, that doesn't qualify as a so-called dollar, but same design. This shows Penn's treaty, very high relief, as we heard before, no rim, which happens on some of the more artistic medals, in my opinion. The obverse is taken from a painting, so I don't actually give full credit for creativity on that one, but I do like the design and the execution. If you're going to show a dead white guy, at least show him in armor, and that's a little bit different. This is another medal, Western themed. I like to think of this one as, looking backwards. It's one of the few medals where you actually have the figure, the subject of the medal looking into the medal. You're seeing the back of his head as he's riding on the bucking bronco. This is one of many medals, so-called dollars, where we just don't know much of what's happening. The reverse side says it was produced in 1933 for the Wolfville Western Days in Tucson. Okay. I searched Google before this meeting just in case something new had come up, and it hasn't. There's basically nothing about this event, but they produce medals, and I like it. From one of the simplest to one of the most complex, this is one of hundreds or possibly thousands of medals produced for the World's Columbian Exposition in 1892 and 1893. There are actually 3 entirely separate scenes here. At the top, you see the discovery of America, Columbus landing in 1492 as appropriate for the Columbian Exposition. On the bottom, you see the landing of the Pilgrims in 1620, which had absolutely nothing to do with the exposition. And the other side of the medal, above portraits of Columbus and Washington, had the famous picture of signing the Declaration of Independence. This was struck in several sizes. The 58 millimeter size is fairly common as medals of this period go. That would not qualify by size as a so-called dollar. This one is a 38 millimeter version, same design, much more reduced. And you can see, by scale, take this whole thing and shrink it down to this big, and those people are really tiny. It's a nice piece of engraving putting this medal together. This is a silver example. You can get white metal examples that hold up well, but the white metals, on average, tend to be a little beat up. So a nice one here is good to find. And this one is, it's not even memory per se, but it's opening of the West. I wanted to get a good Centennial medal. This is produced for the Centennial Exposition, made from silver that was mined in Nevada. That silver was melted into a single ingot, a 600 and something pound ingot, and so that it traveled across the country and was hard to steal because you can't pick it up and put it in your pocket. Made it just fine to Philadelphia. It was refined at the exposition as part of the exhibit, and then struck at the U.S. Mint. There were about 2,000 of these struck from that 600-pound ball of raw silver from Nevada. These medals that I'm showing here, as I mentioned before, typically, we're talking this over lunch, and 1909's VDB penny has a mintage of roughly $500,000, and everyone knows that that's a rare coin. Medals of this type have mintages in thousands. if you're lucky. This one has a mintage of 2000. It's rare, certainly, by the standards of a federal, coin, but it's obtainable. You can get this for a few $100s. This one is a little nicer than most. This is maybe a $500 or $600 example, but you can get $200 or $300 examples. Everything I'm showing in this presentation is actually collectible. These are obtainable pieces. We now transition into something more in the area of art, and with apologies to Ira, I do think of my art as more of the official, what I'm taught in school art. So these are the artistic painting, portraitures type of art that I'm going to show you. This is the official medal for the Panama Pacific Exposition. This was produced the exposition was held in 1915 at the height of the period where artistic coinage was really becoming front and center. So this was this was the last year of the barber coinage, right before the transition to the more attractive Mercury dimes, Standing Liberty Quarters, Walking Liberty halves. This particular medal was produced by Robert Aitken, who also designed the very attractive, although very expensive and not very popular, $50 gold U.S. commemorative coins for the Panama Pacific International Exposition. Like many of the so-called dollars struck for expositions, this was struck at the U.S. Mint exhibit from dies produced by the U.S. Mint. This one's a little unusual that it's 890 fine. I think this may be the only U.S. Mint associated coin struck in that fineness. Weighs 30 grams, which will be important in a moment. This was struck, again, in a number of different compositions. This is the reverse, which I think is just as attractive. And this one is not. This is actually, as far as I or anyone else knows, is a contemporary counterfeit. Some of the so-called dollars were so popular even at the time that they were counterfeited at the time. And if this isn't truly contemporary, it's very old. This has been known in literature and auction sales for 50 years or something like that. It is not a new counterfeit. You can see the quality is different. The color is different. It is unmistakable once you've seen one of them. And these are, the counterfeit is actually rarer than the original. I more often see the counterfeits described as original than described as counterfeits, not fraudulently, but no one actually thinks that counterfeits are something that happen with so-called dollars, and they actually are. I do have some copies that are later productions that I think are made to deceive, but this I'm pretty sure is a contemporary version. They made thousands. I don't have an exact mintage for the official medal. This was in the official medal. People who went to the expo wanted to buy one of these, and they sold an awful lot of them. The contemporary counterfeit is really quite rare compared to the official version. It also weighs, once you are aware of it, barely half the weight, 17 and change grams versus 30 grams of the real version. A second exposition held in California, the Panama, California Exposition, was held roughly the same time period. This is the official medal for that exposition. It was produced in 2 years. The exposition was held in 2 years. The medal was produced, dated 1915, 1916. This is a 1916 version. This was designed by Clifford Berryman, a cartoonist for the Washington Evening Star, a very early depiction. We saw some other ones this morning. Of Uncle Sam. Clifford Berryman, you might be more familiar with, was the cartoonist who produced the original cartoon of Theodore Roosevelt refusing to shoot the bear, which became the basis of the teddy bear. This was engraved by Charles Barber and struck at the U.S. Mint exhibit. And this particular specimen is a little bit interesting because it has a tiny little die crack. You can barely see it. I'll enlarge it above the date. Everyone's seen a die crack. This is what a die crack looks like. Everyone's seen a die crack in various times. This is the die that is cracked, that struck that metal. This is what a die that is cracked, that produces a die cracked metal, looks like. You can see it's reversed. I'll go back briefly. So Uncle Sam is facing to the right on this struck coin, to the left on the inverted die. There is the date sort of towards the bottom left, and the crack proceeds down the side of the die. Because this is a U.S. Mint-produced metal, U.S. Mint-produced dies, we can learn something from the U.S. Mint production practices of the time period by the survival of dies like this. To my surprise, there are actually quite a few, by which I mean at least a few dozen, dies for so-called dollars that have survived, considering that these were, commemorative medals. It's amazing to me that any die has survived at all, let alone a few dozen. You can also see on the very bottom left, on the shank of this die, there's an indented circle, sort of over here. I believe that is sort of some sort of shim screw that holds the die into the press, where you screwed the die and it held the screw and it held the die, and that would have made sense to be a weak point then, which then propagated the die crack up to the face of the die. A slightly later expo, the Centennial Expo, another just beautiful, beautiful piece in my mind, the Flying Pegasus, produced by, as we heard earlier, some of the excellent work produced by the Medallic Art Company. Extremely high relief, such high relief that it basically didn't work, and they changed the design so it wasn't so high relief. Most of this production is this relief, which is fine enough, but if you're looking for a nice example, the differences are really quite striking, if you forgive me. And this is probably, if you're going to have one example, this is the example you want. Century of Progress Expo in 1933 and 1934 was held at the height of the Art Deco period. Many of the medals from this exposition are clearly heavily influenced by the Art Deco movement. You can see this, one of the many medals, very striking lines. You can see that eagle up top looks nothing at all like the eagle I had on my introductory slide from the 1883 Boston Exposition. Very striking, unmistakable Art Deco. Another medal produced from the same exhibit. This is actually an Italian medal, but produced for the American Expo. Again, very high relief, very strong Art Deco influence. The Art Deco period started a little earlier. This is one, another in the category of we really don't know much anything about this. Obviously, it was produced for the Canton, Illinois Centennial, which was held in 1925. The date's on the reverse. Very striking. You can imagine this figure on a car or a car hood ornament or something like that. And these medals were produced. They were produced in limited but obtainable quantities for a single event, and then that was it. The medal is not signed. We don't know who produced it or why, we know why, but we don't know any of the details of the production besides what we can read from the medal itself. Going back a bit, a little more naturalist art style. Here we have, reaching towards the clouds. This is the Pan American Exposition held in Buffalo in 1901. If you defocus your eyes a bit, these clouds that he's standing on are actually the back of an eagle. You can see the eagle's beak towards 8 o'clock. This was produced by George Thomas Brewster. Again, dies engraved at the U.S. Mint, struck in the U.S. Mint exhibit. Obtainable. This is the sort of thing that is clearly, well considered, well thought out artwork in my sense of the word of artwork anyway. The Art Nouveau period had a number of examples as well. I chose this one because it shows the very sweeping lines for the 1904 Atlantic City 50th anniversary. This is made also by Whitehead and Hogue. You can't tell. This is sort of quality. It's gilt pot metal. It's gilt. It's nothing special. but it's very attractive. This also, to the best of my knowledge, violates the original HK rules of no looped pieces. I've never seen an unlooped piece except one that had the loop broke off. There are a lot, unfortunately, in that category, but it's still very attractive Art Nouveau design. This medal is another example of what I would consider, classical art. The Catskill Aqueduct Completion Medal, produced by the ANS in 1917. This was modeled and designed by Daniel Chester French, a very noted artist of the period. Locally, the local connection is Daniel Chester French made the statue of the Minuteman, currently in Concord, Massachusetts. At a national level, he's also responsible for the marble statue of Abraham Lincoln in the middle of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. So you can imagine, a classical trained sculptor thinking about this sort of design as he was making, even commemorative medals to be distributed for generally broad but, limited event audiences. This was struck in 3-inch size. This is the 1.5-inch version that counts as a so-called dollar. This is the other side of the same medal. It's very striking, artistic female form. This was so popular that the whole medal was produced by Medallic Art Company, which I'm looking forward to hearing about very shortly. The Medallic Art Company loved this design of this medal that they produced so much that they actually incorporated it as their own company logo, starting in 1933. The two on the left are an advertising piece produced by the Medallic Art Company in the 1970s. The Medallic Art Company has since gone through a few successors, the latest one being Medallic Art and Mint, and you can see that they actually, in their logo, not only have they incorporated the original founding date of Medallic Art Company, but they've gone back to the original design of the original medal, including the beaded border that Medallic Art Company removed in their version, and the high relief they went back to in the latest example of the logo. So we can wait another 10 or 20 years and see if this sticks around or if it gets another version, or what happens to this. It's now been in use for almost 100 years. Not all commemorative events are positive. San Francisco earthquake and fire was not one of the highlights of our country, but it was certainly a very memorable event. This was another piece where we don't know anything about it. Clearly produced at the time for memory of the event. You can see very stark detail, huge piles of rubble in the foreground. The church tower has been destroyed. The reverse looks very similar, and no idea why it was produced, but no idea who produced it or under what circumstances. There were quite a few of these produced in various medals. And stepping back a little bit earlier, a lot of possibly minor, I could say, expositions in the 1880s, one of them being the Cotton Centennial Exposition in New Orleans. They celebrated cotton, which was obviously important in New Orleans and in the Deep South. And for some reason, they got an artist from Providence, Rhode Island, to generate a medal for the New Orleans Exposition. And he chose to illustrate slaves picking cotton, which is an odd choice for an 1884 medal. But that's what we got. And certainly now, looking back, even if this wasn't intended at the time to be a memory medal, my guess is that it was intended, just totally face up as, look, cotton's good. It's, for us looking back, this is certainly looking back to another time of American history. And finally, to close this out, just a couple for fun. A&P, the Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, sponsored an amusement area within the Century of Progress Exposition. Featured in that was a puppeteer with marionettes. I'm pretty sure that this is produced by that puppeteer. There's a similar design with a cow. And sure, happy pig. Why not? Happy pig. And in case Happy Pig isn't good enough, we have a medal produced for Peach Day in Utah, because doesn't everyone need a peach day? And that's all I have, and thank you for your time. We have
plenty of time for questions. The microphone awaits.
I have a question. This has been great. And maybe it's a little bit ill-formed, maybe it's more than one question, but I notice, as somebody who's collected medals for now 40-ish years, that when I first started collecting medals, maybe it's in line with your 1963 edition, that not that many people collected so-called dollars. They were the kind of thing that, if you saw them at a coin show, they'd be a few dollars, which was even less than other medals. And I don't know which is the chicken and which is the egg as far as the book is concerned, but it's only been until maybe the last 10 or 15 years, 5, 10, 15 years, that so-called dollars are like hot. That's like the hot thing in metals. And I'm wondering, and yet I will also observe from the point of view of the metal collectors of America, we haven't had a lot of overlap or intersection between so-called dollar collectors and that interest and our interest, which has been many other things. Could you comment a little bit on, first, why you think so-called dollars went from 0 to 60 miles an hour and is on its way to becoming 80 miles an hour, and it's been in the Red Book and other things. What we can do to make the rest of metals like that, and also to the extent that there are people who are maybe more coin-oriented and collect so-called dollars from a coin-collecting perspective, how we can draw more of them into the metal collectors of America. That is sort of, how do we make you guys all part of our big group?
Well, just a few questions there. You're going to remind me which parts of them I miss after I hit a few of those. Well, to start off, so-called dollars, despite I put a theme up, there's a huge spectrum. There's 1,000-ish in the original 63 edition. There's about 1,400 in the 2008 edition. And it is literally impossible to collect all of them, because I'm pretty sure Hibbert and Kaplan made some mistakes, and there's some that are listed in 63 that don't exist and never existed. Even if you ignore those, there are 100 to 200 that are basically impossible to collect. Known original mintage of 3 or fewer, and hopefully maybe 1 or 2 survived. So putting together a collection of so-called dollars is not that attractive. People will pick their own subspecialties. Expositions clearly is a theme. Some people do that. There are later themes. There are some military themed ones. There are some local themed ones. Shepherd Pond, mentioned earlier, produced a catalog of Massachusetts of tercentennial medals, which are mostly a little smaller than so-called dollars, but some are so-called dollar size, and some are actually listed as so-called dollars. So why are they difficult? Because they have a name, but they really aren't a thing by themselves. The so-called dollars is an invented term that covers a very broad spectrum. Most recently, over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been one huge change, and that's plastic. NGC started slapping them 10 or 15 years ago, and PCGS has started slapping them within the last 5-ish years. So people who like plastic and have boxes that hold plastic things can now put these in boxes with other plastic things, so that makes them happy. I like holding my medals. For the most part, my medals are not slabs, so that's not for me. But getting to your other point, I like holding my medals. Many of the medals that we saw earlier, I have to hold the medals, and I don't enjoy doing that. So for me, the so-called dollars fit a happy medium between holding the medal and breaking out the magnifying glass to look at, for example, Civil War tokens, which I know are extremely popular and not for me. So this is a happy medium. And I've missed several of your questions. What haven't I touched on?
It appears to me that people who collect so-called dollars are not generally aware of, let alone involved in the metal collectors in America. What can you say that, or what could we do that would foster more connection?
I can speak for myself, obviously not for everyone else. I was not a member of Metal Collectors for a long time. Metal Collectors has historically presented itself to the rest of the world, in my opinion, in two facets. One is the art metal facet, which we heard about earlier, and one is the extremely fascinating to me, but a little more removed, Betts metal, really expensive, really historic things, which I love from a distance, but I'm not going to collect them. And I choose not to collect art medals, again, because I like to hold my medals and not hold my medals. So that's why I didn't join. I like the history of so-called dollars. I like variety, even if I'm not going to collect all of them. I like the themes. Metals is a huge area. I mean, you might as well call yourself Exonomia Collectors of America, and it's an even huger area. I don't know. I haven't joined TAMS either. They present themselves more as good for tokens in recent years, and I'm not interested in that. So, and they're not only good for tokens either. It's just, so I don't have a good answer.
Dave Bowers has
Yeah.
Original distributor of the book put out by Coins and Currency. And one of the reasons they were not popular is that so-called dollars, the Erie Canal metal was very popular, continued to be. The Colorado dollars of 1933 were popular. The Nevada Centennial one was. But what happened is that Harry Lesson and a number of people, not Charles Kaplan lived in California. I knew all these people. He put out a book in California Tokens. They came up to us and they said, we have a large stock of some of these things, and these are in the book at like $25 each. We'll give you some at $10 each. And they had hundreds of them. And they went around the different places like Stax and Lester Merkin, and that sort of killed it. And they were dead for many years just because the people put in large stocks of them. Like Harry Lesson had, I don't know if it made the book or not, but the first Boeing 707 airplane, he had hundreds and hundreds of those made, and then there's a big splash of it in the book, but there was no demand, and by telling all the dealers it was sort of a profit scheme, that's what killed it until the new generation, when we also have Jeff Shevlin, of course, and who had a conference on so-called metals, and today they're very dynamic, but that's why they weren't dynamic for about 15 years.
Yeah.
I would second that. There was resentment because of the prices of the catalog. I'm sorry. There was actually resentment of the field because of the prices on there. I would imagine it was Kaplan's fault, because I know he did a book on California tokens, which gets good reviews, but he was partnering with Steve Album, and I remember Steve told me he sold him a token we said was old, and then Steve found out there were too many digits in the phone number, so it couldn't be old, and they split up. So maybe Mr. Kaplan wasn't the nicest person. But do you know anything about Hibbler? Because the book is very good. There's a lot of good historical information. They did a lot of research pre-internet age.
Yeah. No, I don't know very much about. Kaplan is obviously California. California tokens were his thing. Hibbler, I understand, was Boston related. There's clearly a strong New England Boston bent in the so-called dollar book from '63, but I don't have much information. I do understand that most of their original notes still exist. I know who has them. He is not someone who's easy to work with, and I've never seen them personally.
Mr. Hibbler and Mr. Kaplan were not involved in this promotion at all. They were pure. It was other people giving them advice and having things listed. I remember when all this happened, I knew the other people.
Yeah, the so-called dollars, as I said, many of them are quite common. They were intended to be common. They were the souvenir medals, for example, for events and exhibitions. The Columbian Exposition was an exposition for 2 years, parts of 2 years. There were an awful lot of people who went to the Columbian Exposition. If a tiny fraction of them brought a medal, that's a lot of medals out there. Survival rates, quality, condition, all play a factor, but generally there's enough medals to go around for many of these examples. About half, there's 1,400-ish medals on the website, up there on the website, including composition variants. I'd say about half of them, 700-ish, are easily collectible. If you want one, you can go out and find one in a few months. You can get your hands on it. Another 300 to 400 are, you can get one, but you have to work on it, and the last bunch are just really, really, really tough.
So I got hooked early on. I don't need that. Oh, recorded? I don't know if I'm recorded or not. But I got hooked on what David was sort of hinting to a little earlier, that many of them were $1 or $2 that were listed for $20 and $30. I started with Charles Kirkley long time ago, maybe 1985, and then Tony Swiker had the first list I ever saw, other than pamphlets that have been talked about here a little previously. And then Joe Levine got involved, and for many years I bought every so-called dollar that he had as his auctions until about 2006 or something like that. And then I discovered him back in this city here about, 10, 12 years ago. And he was just completing the second edition, which I would, like Paul say, an excellent improvement on the original Kaplan and Hibbler book. I talked to Mr. Kaplan on many occasions, and he would sometimes have auctions of items that he didn't bid, but sat in the back of the room and sort of nodded his head, and I think he enjoyed that they went away, but I don't even know if they were his. But currently we have someone that I won't name, just like you didn't name, that is maybe massacring a little bit of what's going on, especially with the modernization of the slabbing issue. I'll just give you one issue and then I'll sit down. I'm a North American guy. I've been doing that for longer than all the rest. And they have a little badge that's somewhat questionable whether it was clipped to be put in the book or not. And it has a little hang for the ribbon. And if you sent them in, you would find that you'd had to clip the ribbon off, but NGC would slab them, and then all of a sudden they were worth $250. Whereas the raw ones, I'd been selling for $50 a piece. And I thought, that's a little anti-sacrimonious, but nevertheless, people that want slabs, they really are paying the difference. And there are more of them coming out, and the market, I'm sure, will even off eventually, but the modernization of plastic has helped. As a matter of fact, just recently, my friend sitting down here said that he sent some into PCGS, the Wiener medals I mentioned earlier, and now they're in a big plastic holder, and I don't know if they'll be worth more or not, but a lot of people, like you said earlier, like to have them and feel them in their hands. And sort of like colonial items, I'm sort of for that still. There you go. My thought.
The advent of slabbing has certainly changed things, to say the least. As with many areas, so-called dollars in slabs, I'm not going to say are worth more, but sell for higher numbers than similar ones outside of slabs. Typically more than enough to pay for the cost of getting it into the slab. So when I sell stuff, I tend to slab it and then sell it. The ones I keep for myself aren't slabbed, so I know what I have that isn't in the population report, and I suspect there's a lot of others that aren't in the population report also.
I just want to say that I find that the book is very useful. The size convention I find is very frustrating because people generally don't collect like that. You don't say, well, I'm just going to collect 19 millimeter things. You collect by topic. So I find, for example, I collect U.S. Mint medals. And of course, many of these pieces were struck at the Mint, so they're included. But if you look, for example, at the expositions, there are things that are included or excluded. So I'll go to the book looking for Columbiana, and some pieces are there, but if it's too big, well, then you gotta look at Eagle, you have to look at another source. Some of the things were struck in multiple metals, as you've shown on there. So it's kind of like, well, these other metals kind of exist, but we're not gonna talk about them, because they're the wrong size. And of course, in some instances, like the Hudson-Fulton metals, they were struck in multiple sizes, but only the one size was included. But you'd like to know about the whole series, and yet there are 4 other or 5 other sizes that, well, now where do you look to get that information? So I find it's kind of very limiting in a sense that, the information is useful, but it would be nice if there was maybe a more expansive guide for a lot of this material.
Yeah. Expansive is difficult because of the quantities that we're dealing with. There's a lot of metals. I'll give a plug to Jeff Shevlin, who was mentioned earlier, who along with Bill Hyder are producing, they just put out the first book on, I'm not going to get the title right, but something along the lines of So-Called Dollars of West Coast Expositions. So their interest is in expositions and so-called dollars, but they are expanding their book to include things that wouldn't be officially so-called dollars because it's their book and they can do whatever they want, and hats off to them. There's obviously U.S. mint metals. Because so-called dollars are and it's an artificial category, it overlaps with so many other areas, and that's fine by me, but yes, so-called dollars are a little strange beast on their own.
Hi. So in terms of the difference between metals and so-called dollars, I got into metals because of the art, and I found it really hard to find information about them online. So when you compare the information available for so-called dollars and the information available for 20th century American metals, for example, online, there's much more out there for so-called dollars, particularly for newcomers who have no clue what something might be worth. I think that might have something to do with higher popularity among collectors.
I guess that was it.
Thanks.